Good afternoon and welcome to What Does China Mean When It Talks About Multilateralism? This event is co-hosted by Chatham House and China Dialogue as part of London Climate Action Week. I'm Sam Giel. I'm Associate Fellow in the Energy, Environment and Resources Programme at Chatham House and Acting CEO at China Dialogue, which is a fully bilingual website devoted to open discussion on all issues around climate change and the environment, with a special focus on China. This event is taking place on the record and is being recorded. Audience members can also actively participate in the discussion. Please just enter your questions in the Q&A box. I'd also ask you to identify yourself and your affiliation when you ask the question if you can. As the world's largest carbon emitter by volume, China plays a crucial role in global climate talks this year. And it's also a significant player across the Sustainable Development Goals, from hosting the UN Biodiversity Summit to its approach to vaccines, to debt and development finance. This is a critical year for the post-pandemic economic recovery. It sees summits of all three Rio conventions, the G20 and G7 summits, China's rollout of its 14th five-year plan, the rollout too of the European Green Deal and more. And of course, it comes amid growing geopolitical tensions in an increasingly multipolar world. This discussion will explore the role that China can play in helping to achieve those goals, a sustainable economic recovery and an ambitious deal at COP26 for two, and how this intersects with China's specific notion of multilateralism, a term that in its basic sense, of course, refers to any diplomatic interaction by more than two states, but is often used as a synonym for the post-war liberal international order. And for China, increasingly refers to another set of emergent institutions, such as those around the Belt and Road Initiative. How this affects debates around climate change, vaccines, and more seems to be a critical question for better understanding China's role. Our panelists today can hopefully help us think through this. Malin is Director of the China Programme at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute and the author of Decoding China. Baiford Zhang is Senior Policy Advisor in the Climate Diplomacy team at E3G, a London-based think tank, and Yunnan Chen is Senior Research Officer in the Development and Public Finance Programme at the Overseas Development Institute, or ODI. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to open with a 5 to 7 minute opening statement on the topic, starting with Malin. Malin Aud, what does China mean when it talks about multilateralism?
Well, thank you very much, Sam, for that question. And thank you so much to China Dialogue and Chatham House for inviting me to this very interesting discussion. The panel that was just before us already started discussing a bit definitions and also touched upon this global competition over values and standards in a multipolar world. And last year is widely regarded as a low point for multilateralism. And the dictionary project that you mentioned, Sam, is something we co-authored, me and two other sinologists or China specialists based in Berlin and Stockholm, because we felt that the European China debate is plagued by a lot of platitudes about China, such as we have to cooperate with China because of climate. So in our dictionary, we think it's important, not the least, because China is on this quest for increased discourse power and wants to be defining or redefining international terms. We thought it was very important to increase understanding in Europe for what China means with these terms, because oftentimes we use the same words, and for some of these words, it may be very obvious that we don't mean the same things, such as human rights and democracy. But for other terms that are less political or seemingly, at least on the surface, politically neutral, like multilateralism or cooperation, we think we mean the same thing. So what we do in the dictionary is set these terms in a Chinese political and historical context. So what does the Chinese Communist Party mean when it says we should cooperate and we should We should not politicize global issues, and the US should stop with its Cold War mentality, and let's all join hands and strive towards a shared destiny of mankind. So if I move on to, and I just want to say also before I go on to try and describe what China means when it talks about multilateralism, I want to say also that I don't think this framing of cooperation versus confrontation or competition is helpful at all. It doesn't help the issues forward at all. And I think both China uses it and we use it. So China's also said, or Chinese diplomats have said that cooperation on climate is conditional on other countries' non-interference in China's internal affairs. But in practice, that's not really how things work. So what does China mean when it talks about multilateralism? Well, I think one important part of it is that China claims that the existing multilateral system is not fair and just, 不公平正义, but that it safeguards the narrow interests of a group. So China wants to change or to have democracy at the UN and to have a bigger say. So China talks a lot about, or the Chinese Communist Party talks a lot about China's right to speak, and that there needs to be increased democracy at the UN, and that China is a leader of the developing world, standing up against Western imperialism. China also emphasizes BRI as an alternative multilateralism with Chinese characteristics, and that there should be dialogue without confrontation and partnerships without alliance. And this also means if you sort of put multilateralism, the Chinese definition of multilateralism in a word cloud, the words surrounding multilateralism would be sovereignty, non-interference, development, win-win cooperation, as opposed to an EU or US word cloud, which would include the words human rights, democracy, multi-stakeholderism. So fundamental differences. So the big question that I would like to discuss with my co-panelists is, given that there are these ideological differences or different political systems underpinning multilateralism, is pragmatic cooperation on the climate possible? Or are we, as Biden would have it, engaged in an epic global contest between autocracy and democracy? So the question is also, is it possible, like the EU tends to do, to sort of say that we should see China as a necessary cooperation partner on climate and an economic competitor, and then a systemic rival, and sort of compartmentalize these issues? I'm not sure. I hope so, but I'm not sure that's feasible, or if it's fruitful to sort of set aside these ideological differences. But I'm ready to be challenged, and I'm very keen to discuss.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that introduction, Malin. That gives us a lot to get stuck into. I'd love to hear Bai for Sang really get stuck into all of those questions, but I guess I'll just start by asking you to set out, climate change, of course, is a sort of pillar of the multilateral order, and China, as the biggest emitter in the world, obviously has to play an essential role in any solution to that problem. What does China mean when it talks about multilateralism in this particular field?
Thanks, Sam, and thanks, Malin, for the introduction. So looking forward to discuss those questions with you. So perhaps what I would do is first to answer Sam's question. So, and then in terms of how China's position has evolved within the kind of UN climate body, and then also have a look about how China has positioned climate within its foreign policy, and then finally end on kind of an overview of China's contribution to addressing climate change beyond kind of the UNFCCC or the UN climate body and in other multilateral venues. So in terms of how China's position has evolved, so Beijing's approach to climate governance has evolved since the days when it is seen as an obstructor of global climate governance. So by that day, we mean about 12 years ago in the Copenhagen climate negotiations. So China was seen as taken on the blame for the failure of the Copenhagen negotiation. So China was reportedly arguing against long-term mid-century targets, 1.5 degree goals, and even rejected developed countries to take on binding targets because they see it as a risk that the pressure would be onto them a couple of years later. So back then, China is still wary about a commitment on climate globally would limit the space or the flexibility or room to maneuver for their economic and development policies. So that's like 12 years ago. But since then, I mean, China has actively engaged in negotiations under the UN body, which is the United Nations frameworks on climate change, so the UNFCCC for short. And it is the platform through which the Paris Agreement was negotiated. And China considers the UNFCCC the preeminent international forum for addressing matters related to climate change, which is sort of in line with China views on multilateralism, which I think Malin also touched on, which sees that UN as the only kind of rightful international system and the UN Charter as the paramount rule book for that guides the international relations. So, and then within this UNFCCC, so the body adopts a principle that recognizes the differences between capacities of developing and developed countries in addressing climate change. So the common but differentiated responsibility principle. So China has long been very clear that it continues to regard itself as a developing country within this UNFCCC, and it is still catching up in the Western industrialized world, and hence the developed countries should provide support to China and also other developing countries in achieving the climate goals. So while the kind of principle of common but differentiated responsibility remains an important principle for China's position at the UNFCCC, but there are signals that Beijing is actually placing less emphasis on this principle. So we saw that last year with the announcement of the carbon neutrality target Mr. Xi made at the last UN General Assembly. So China was actually one of the first major developing emitters to make such commitment, even before the US, South Korea, and Japan, like developed countries, they have made those announcements before at the time that China announced it. So China was a step ahead of the developed countries in making those announcements on carbon neutrality. And also China has signaled its willingness to support developing countries on energy transition. So I'll touch on that a little bit later as well. And climate change in the domestic policy context is no longer seen as a burden, but an opportunity in China's economic development. So that can be seen in China's development strategy, not least the Made in China 2025 plans, where some of the green tech sectors is core to the kind of industrial strategy of China. So we have seen that China has evolved in those positions. So in terms of foreign policy, so how China has positioned climate change in its foreign policy and in its dealings with other countries. So climate change has been moving, I would argue, to the center stage of China's foreign policy and geopolitical strategy, especially in the last year. So with the carbon neutrality announcement. So China has used that to improve its positions vis-a-vis the EU and the US, and also position China as a global leader in climate because it was actually a step ahead of a lot of the developed countries. And so that's kind of point number one on kind of the foreign policy. And then the second point is China's actions on climate is not only considered as a contribution to multilateralism by Chinese policymakers, but they also believe that climate targets and actions are central to China's external strategy to help paint the country in a good light. So in a recent high-level meeting chaired by Han Zheng, which is the Politburo member and number 7 in the Communist Party, he said that policymakers should actively promote China's commitments, targets, measures, and the effectiveness of China's policies to tell China's story, well. So, which is in line with Mr. Xi remarks at a week later in a central committee, where he said that the policymakers should and diplomats should be working together to create a more credible, lovable, and respectable image of China. So climate is seen as part of that strategy. So yeah, so those are the kind of China's position in climate, UN climate body and foreign policy. So I would end on perhaps some benchmarks on what are the China's contribution to climate and multilateralism. So whether China is genuine to its commitment on climate, and because I think some in the West is always kind of skeptical about China's ability to meet those targets, and also whether China is a global leader. I think the answer is too early to tell, but in order to answer that question, we should look beyond China's actions within the UN climate body, but more broadly on positions and action in different multilateral venues that are climate related. And I think there are 4 such areas. So the first one is on China's support on energy transition in developing countries. So this isn't something that China has actively participated or advocated until very recently. China's stance on this matter is a responsibility of developed countries to do that. But with the Belt and Road Initiative, there has been a lot of high-level rhetoric coming from China about greening the BRI and supporting renewable technology investments in those countries, but not necessarily reducing fossil fuel investment in those countries, although we have seen that investment trend actually came down in recent years. But there are also some other positive signs. So the Ministry of Environment actually published a guideline on BRI saying that coal investment should be under more scrutiny and potentially put out on a list of a red list. So that's a development. And for the first time, China actually have made some linkages between BRI and Paris Agreement in the recent Green BRI partnership that was just announced last week, where 28 countries joined China in making those pledges. So that's one area. I'll be very brief. I know my time is up. So the second area is support on climate adaptation efforts in developing countries. So again, this is not something China consider very actively, but seen as a responsibility of developed countries. But actually, China has made some commitments on South-South climate cooperation and set up a fund worth of $3.1 billion to help developed countries to tackle climate change. So we should watch out for that. And thirdly, China has also actively participated in the reform of international financial regulations in terms of setting standards on what means as a sustainable activity in terms of financial regulation. So that's also something to look out for. And finally, how China is supporting developing countries in helping them with the fiscal space crisis that is created by COVID and the pandemic from last year. So I think Yunnan, my colleague, will talk about that a little bit more. So I'll end there and looking forward to the discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Byford. And yeah, that leaves us in a perfect place to move on to Yunnan's comments. Just a note that I would invite attendees to post their questions in the Q&A because I'll turn to the floor after Yunnan's comments. So Yunnan, on the topic of development finance, that of course clearly plays a critical role also in any kind of order that we might understand as the multilateral order, the post-Bretton Woods order. What is the role of China in development finance, and what's the role of multilateralism in China's approach to development finance?
Great, thanks so much, Sam. So I will try and structure my remarks around three areas. So in focusing on China's multilateralism in the development finance space, I think there are three salient areas to raise here. First is the expansion of sort of Chinese multilateral initiatives like the BRI and before that FOCAC. The second area I want to turn to is China's recent participation in new multilateral initiatives around debt in developing countries. And finally, I want to discuss the emerging and evolving role of China in the multilateral development banks. So the first point on the BRI, this is probably the first and biggest elephant in the room when we think of China in the multilateral space. You know, you have this very expansive cross-border initiative that now spans 140 countries. The curious thing about the BRI is that it's really hard to say that it's really a multilateral initiative. In many ways, like the FOCAC, the Forum of China-Africa Cooperation that has been around for the last 20 years, the BRI is still in many ways more of a hub and spoke system. So individual countries sign agreements or they sign an MOU with China, and through that we have an enhanced channel of bilateral cooperation. But there isn't really a clear platform that China is facilitating for cooperation between countries in the BRI. So there's a real absence of that, especially visible when you look at cross-border projects, for example, with railways in Southeast Asia or in East Africa. China doesn't play a facilitating role, even if it's Chinese finance constructing these projects. And likewise, you know, the Forum of China-Africa Cooperation, or FOCAC, has been a defining institution of China-Africa engagement over the last 2 decades or more. And it's been really useful for African governments to approach Chinese leadership directly. It facilitates a bilateral channel there. But the purpose of FOCAC is not really for African governments to coordinate with each other. I think something that's distinctive about these Chinese multilateral organizations is that there is an underlying narrative that stands in contrast to the sort of the G7 offer or to the traditional donors. The contributors from Pandapur Dragonclaw actually highlighted this recently in the contrast between, as Byford mentioned, the Belt and Road Green Development Partnership Initiative, in contrast to the G7 B3W, the Build Back Better World, where the G7 countries really portray themselves as sort of the primary actors or the protagonists with the capital that are going to invest in the global south, whereas the language of the BRI partnership is, at least rhetorically, there's a much greater emphasis on developing country ownership. So China is an initiator, a collaborator, but it's not the owner. The second area I want to talk about is on debt, which has become a very salient issue in the last year that's affected a plethora of low-income countries that have been badly hit by the economic impacts of COVID. And this is an area where China's approach around multilateralism is, we can see directly evolving and shifting over time. And there's a growing recognition from China on the side of the need for multilateral cooperation. Last year, we had a quite politically significant moment with the creation of the G20 DSSI, which was the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, which China joined. As many of you are aware, China has become the largest bilateral lender in many low-income countries, but to date, it's refused to join the Paris Club of creditor countries. It's not a member of the OECD DAC donor clubs. But here, you know, China gave full support to the DSSI, and this is the first time we've seen China join a multilateral debt initiative of this sort. With the DSSI, there's been a lot of contestation though, and it hasn't been a perfect process. So whilst China supported it full-throatedly, the language around its participation in the DSSI still emphasizes bilateral channels of debt restructuring, and a lot of the debt workouts that we've seen from borrowers that have borrowed from China has been through these bilateral channels. And so there's still a sense of sort of one foot out the door. We support multilateralism, but we prefer bilateral solutions. More recently, there's been a bit of an evolution in the G20 common framework. And here, the common framework for debt restructuring really attempts to redress some of the weaknesses of the DSSI. So here, it encompasses all Chinese creditors, as well as private sector creditors, which the previous DSSI did not. The common framework also has a lot of its own weaknesses, which I won't get into, but it is significant that China has joined what is essentially a sort of Paris Club Plus initiative around debt restructuring for the first time, and is playing a constructive and collaborative role in it, and is engaging in technical cooperation as well with the IMF. So I think for China, there's a clear recognition of the need for this kind of structure, these problems around debt that are not China's responsibility alone. And I think China recognizes that participation in these initiatives serves both its material interests as a creditor, as well as the kind of image that it wants to project as a responsible and respected global power. On my final point on the MDBs, as Byford discussed, China has been a long-standing strong supporter of the UN and multilateral institutions, but it's also played a growing and evolving role in the Multilateral Development Bank system, or MDBs. At ODI, we have a paper coming out in the next few months from Chris Humphrey and myself, where we look at China's quite eclectic engagement with MDBs. So we see three aspects of China's engagement with MDBs. First, that it's become a significant financier to major large MDBs, some of it through innovative means, through billion-dollar co-financing funds in major MDBs like the IFC, African Development Bank, and IDB. Secondly, it has the broadest membership of any major power in a plethora of small regional MDBs in Africa and Latin America. And third, it's also responsible for the creation of the two newest MDBs, the AIIB and the BRICS New Development Bank. So in relative terms, the financing to these MDBs is still quite small relative to the flows of bilateral finance. But why is China supporting these MDBs? They're clearly of significant strategic value. We argue that China's support for these MDBs is in part a way to enhance its credibility as a responsible global power. It wants to increase its voice and influence within these institutions, and it's now creating new institutions where it can play a substantive role where existing institutions can't facilitate that. But throughout all of this, China is not trying to disrupt the existing system. The new MDBs use existing models, whilst at the same time integrating China's own experiences and ideas about how to do development within them. And China recognizes the value of these multilateral institutions. They value the technical knowledge, the way that they operate, and also as a neutral platform relatively for cooperation. And it's created new platforms. I can discuss this later, but the creation of the Multilateral Cooperation Center for Development Finance, or MCDF, is a demonstration of a desire, I think, to integrate the learnings and practices from that multilateral space into the bilateral BRI. So just to conclude with some key takeaways. One, China values multilateral institutions and their contribution and role in global development. And I think there is a strong recognition that they are essential for cooperation on key global challenges. Two, China is pursuing a greater role within them and wants to be recognized as a responsible and credible global power, and other countries can work with that. There's still a bit of a paradox where, rhetorically, China supports multilateral institutions and initiatives, but in practice, it still strongly favors bilateral channels in its engagement with developing countries around lending and in debt negotiations, but this is slowly changing. And finally, for China, drawing on what Malin discussed previously, I think multilateralism means something broader. China seeks to increase its own voice as a sort of leader of the developing world, but by extension, it's trying to increase representation of the interests of other developing countries within the international system. And so a truly legitimate multilateral order can't be one that's dominated by the sort of G7 world. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That's really great round of sort of statements to kick us off. Before I go to the floor, I thought I'd take the opportunity to pose one question, maybe first actually to Byford, based on Malin's opening remarks, because I thought it was really interesting that you drew out, I think, one sort of common theme that we maybe take for granted, which is sort of this notion of cooperation versus competition and whether that's actually significant. And as you note, one of the sort of emergent definitions of China's own approach to multilateralism is this idea of dialogue without confrontation. And there is this supposed primacy put on the notion of cooperation above competition on climate change. But how useful is that, and how do you view that? I mean, Byford, in the realm of climate change, do you think it's meaningful to talk about prioritizing competition above cooperation above competition? Is that what multilateralism means, or are there other ways through this?
Yeah, I think that all depends on what people mean when they talk about climate competition, because I think the notion varies. I think some people, when they think about climate cooperation, competition, then they think about, as the US and the EU are thinking about, in terms of strengthening their research capabilities, innovative capabilities, having partnerships around green tech innovation, which are things that could, drive as the panel before us actually talked about, would drive a race to the top. So I think in terms of, if that's the kind of competition that we are engaged in, then I think it's a positive dynamic that we might want to create and might work under the current political climate for a domestic audience in the EU or the US. But when other people think about, climate competition, then they think about in terms of climate sanctions. So as China kind of takes climate change to the realm of foreign policy, now we get a lot of foreign policy discussion around how do we deal with climate, how do we deal with China in terms of climate, and then they will start thinking about kind of using usual foreign policy toolbox in terms of sanctions and other means to kind of in climate policy. So if that's the kind of climate competition that we're thinking about, then I don't think that's an effective way to drive more climate action that is required for the world to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. And I would just end by saying one of the pitfalls of the climate competition or the kind of sanction mentality strategy is kind of the risk of alienating the progressive voices within China, because the tenser the geopolitical environments get, and the greater the confrontation dynamics between the West and China is, the less space that progressives within China, talking about climate space. So if they're, advocating for more ambitious climate policy in terms of renewable energy, then if there's a greater confrontation dynamics in play, like their ideas may get shot down because of concerns around energy security, because China still imports large amounts of oil and gas externally. So I think those are the things that we should think about in terms of balancing that competition and cooperation dynamics. But I don't see competition as a no-go zone. I think that's the reality of the geopolitics that we have to deal with today.
Thank you. Unless anyone has anything to add on that point, I might Yeah.
Maybe I can add just a reflection. I thought both Byford and Yunnan's comments were really interesting. And I just wanted to add that, I mean, this cooperation and confrontation, it's not only an East versus West or autocracy versus democracy or North-South thing. I think big hegemonic powers or superpowers, countries that are big have very different perspectives on multilateralism compared to small countries like Sweden. So in Sweden, I mean, multilateralism is almost like a religion. And I think what Yunnan said about China's sort of the way China works in practice with multilateral institutions, and it's a form of multilateralism is what we call it in our dictionary, and I think that's a good description perhaps. And then on Byford's remarks about China seeing the UN as the only legitimate body, which is very true. The problem is that the UN is based on 3 pillars. So peace and security, development, and human rights. And within the UN, different countries put different emphasis on those 3 pillars, obviously. And China tends to emphasize the 2 pillars of peace and security and development, and not so much human rights. So even within the UN, which is broadly considered the legitimate body, there's very different ways of working as well. And then finally, I thought it's very useful, like Byford said, to think of China's actions as motivated by self-interest and not really being motivated by whether we cooperate or confront or compete with China. I think that's a much better way of approaching it.
On that, could I put to you one of the questions that's come up from the floor? Because I feel like that sort of gets at it. There's a question from someone called Javier Pujos, apologies on the pronunciation, who says, the topic is what does multilateralism mean to China, but how does multilateralism translate in the language of the Chinese government? Is this a way to dominate other countries economically in a quote unquote, we help you to build, you buy from us, one-way multilateral relationship? Or should we expect true cooperation with developing countries? This I suppose goes to Yunnan's sort of question as well, but Malin, do you have a view based on your work of sort of how the Chinese government really talks about multilateralism or really understands it?
Well, I don't think it's sort of either China does it not out of self-interest or it's all motivated by self-interest. I think all countries pursue multilateralism also to satisfy own geopolitical interests and so forth. So I think the big difference perhaps between how China defines multilateralism as compared to liberal democracies is the emphasis on non-interference and the emphasis on sovereignty, China's sovereignty, and then this sort of pursuing bilateral relations above sort of that's how the China initiated multilateral institutions work as well, as Yunnan said. But maybe Yunnan want to expand on that.
Yunnan, you're muted, but I don't know if you want to expand on that or if you'd like to. What I could add into it is there's another question in the chat that sort of picks up, which is from Jennifer Tolman that says on the topic of MDBs, how does China's non-interventionist interpretation of multilateralism support or obstruct a critical role for multilateral development banks or regional public banks in funding the global green transition, such as the acceleration of the Paris alignment of MDB portfolios in the G20? I don't know if you want to either pick up on that last question and or sort of talk about how that particular notion of non-interventionism as contested as it is may fit with those kinds of MDB ambitions.
I think first thing to say is that this notion of non-intervention is not something that's solely Chinese concept, right? It's one that's shared by pretty much much of the developing world, particularly in low-income countries that have probably faced the brunt of quite damaging economic interventions over the last few decades from these multilateral development banks. So the sort of alternative that China presents as a development financier, and both in its sort of bilateral or multi-bilateral initiatives, and also via its influence in the MDBs, I think is an attractive alternative, let's say, you know, in the MDBs that China has created or co-created as well. We also see a greater embodiment of some of these Chinese values around being a lot more responsive to developing country needs. So this is, of course, there are points of conflict, of course, between the green agenda and the development agenda. Also points of overlap, but I think what China kind of brings to the MDBs is a slightly greater voice or representation of the development interests of low-income countries and developing countries in prioritizing a sort of development first agenda, or at least balancing that alongside you know, a green transition or a just transition.
So there's a question from the floor which I wanted to put to Byford, which was the first one that came in, which is really about how you differentiate between China's domestic and international climate policy, particularly actually looking at its domestic air pollution policy. So it says, how would you differentiate between China's policy towards climate change and its policy to reduce national air pollution? On the one hand, China is intent on reducing air pollution by reducing fossil fuels. But on the other, as you note, it's funding fossil fuel energy under the Belt and Road Initiative. This kind of gets at a key fault line. Could you talk us through it, Byford?
Yeah, so I think that there are two questions there. So like the differentiation between kind of air pollution and climate policy, and the differentiation between domestic climate, air, and foreign kind of climate and air policy. So in terms of kind of, I mean, national air pollution policy. So I think if you look at the air pollution policies in the last, I think, 5 years, I think China has actually done a great job in reducing pollutants in major population centers, you know, Yangtze River Delta, Beijing area, and the Zhejiang Delta. So, so that's obviously there are you know, measures that are, you know, very unique to China in terms of shutting down you know, factories in very short notice. But I think overall the policies that were put in place and the kind of environmental task force that has been used in enforcing that policy could be a way that China perhaps is considering in terms of implementing its climate policy. So we saw that there was a central environmental inspection team that report directly to the central government instead of the Ministry of Environment, which has been very successful in enforcing the kind of climate, the air pollution targets. And I think China, in talking about meeting its peaking targets by before 2030, I think it has talked about enlisting that environmental inspection team again. So I think we should look forward to China using similar strategy in terms of creating a very targeted policy objective with a specialist enforcement team in getting to those targets. And in terms of the kind of differentiation between domestic and you know, overseas energy and climate policy. So, I mean, indeed, there's a gap at the moment. Like, but then I would say that in terms of looking at the China domestic target, a lot of the civil society group would consider China's target as not kind of ambitious enough, also domestically. So I think China would still have a some homework to do in terms of aligning their targets, domestic energy targets, and kind of foreign overseas targets with the Paris Agreement. And I think on the overseas front, I think with the major financiers of overseas coal moving away from coal, so Japan and South Korea both have committed in the last few months, that they will end overseas finance on coal power plants by the end of the year. So I think that the kind of all eyes will now be on China to see whether it would make similar commitments ahead of COP, and then that would be a huge step in bringing us closer to meeting the Paris Agreement.
I was going to go to another question from the floor, but I guess I'd actually like to come back to you, Byford, really quickly, just to say, could you maybe say a bit more about what kinds of progress you feel we need on the road to COP26, and how that fits with this discussion? Because that seems really like a critical question that's hanging over all of this and maybe hasn't been answered directly, which is, you know, if we're going to get to a position globally where we can actually see the kind of climate diplomacy achieving some kind of success, where do you need to see the movement, and is China playing a progressive role?
Yeah, so I think just very briefly. So I think for COP to be a success, as the UK COP presidency and also President Biden has kind of articulated, the success of COP would hinges on keeping the 1.5 degree temperature increase target within reach. And in order to do that, we would definitely need China to move in terms of its current climate and energy targets. So in terms of climate, then we would need China to set its peak sooner than it has pledged, which is now before 2030 or around 2030 previously, and it should be much earlier. So even before the middle of this decade would be a benchmark to watch out for. And then in terms of energy, and notably on coal, like to align with a more ambitious pathway, China would need to stop coal, the building of new coal power plants as soon as possible, and to commit to end or unabated coal, which is coal without any kind of carbon capture technologies, at some point between 2040 and 2045. So I think that would be the kind of the benchmarks that we should look out for. And how likely China might achieving that, I mean, I think is still a question that we all want to know. So I think we should look out for signs at some of these multilateral venues, because I think if China is to announce a new commitment, it would do that not at a bilateral meeting, but at a multilateral space like the UN, which China has done. China has announced its like new surprise target on carbon neutrality at the UN General Assembly last year.
Thank you. There's a question here from Han Guoyi that I think I'll pose to Malin, which is sort of starts with the supposition that the rise of China is still a fairly recent phenomenon, albeit a rapid one. So are some of the Chinese characteristics of multilateralism discussed here transitional as compared to the kind of existing great powers? In other words, do you see a sort of convergence between these different interpretations and practices of multilateralism, or a divergence?
That's a really good question. And I guess the question is who is converging with who? I mean, the assumption was always that China would be socialized. The West's assumption was always that China would be socialized into accepting existing international norms. But recently, with China's rise and growing influence and superpower status, we have seen that China seeks to influence international norms and have a greater say, and sort of promoting China's right to speak at the UN and democracy at the UN and all of this discourse. So I think China maybe wants to see others converging with Chinese principles and norms as much as we seek to do that with China. So yes, I guess there will be some convergence, but we don't know towards what end. I think it also relates, Hangui's question relates a little bit to what I reflected on before, that different countries, depending on their size, will have different notions of multilateralism. So I think in that sense, it can be transitional, that China has put an increased emphasis on its right to define international principles and to be sort of a leader of the developing world in international affairs that is also in line with its growing status, superpower status. So in that sense, it's transitional, but I'm not sure who is converging with whom.
Thank you. We're coming close to the top of the hour, but a couple more questions I'm going to try and fit in. Patrick Flynn asks, says that China's involvement in multinational development banks is a positive thing and has successfully been involved with green projects, but has already run into problems regarding, I assume this is given as an example, inefficient electricity grids in the Asia region or producing that kind of efficiency. Is there a possibility that trust is misplaced? How could this be addressed? Yunnan, could you sort of say a bit about how China's involvement in the MDBs sort of is playing out in terms of, for example, the renewable energy transition?
Sure. I just want to comment a little bit on the previous question as well, and to add to what Malin already discussed a bit. I think in the MDB space, actually, this is an area where we are seeing a bit of kind of what Greg Chen from the University of York in Canada puts as two-way socialization. So as China has had greater influence in the MDB space and through the creation of the NDB and AIIB, there has been a sort of convergence from the other direction towards not new norms, but shifted norms. So for example, in the AIIB, having a non-resident board, having a much more streamlined process that is more responsive to developing country needs. This is something that I think has been taken in or internalized by the major MDBs like the World Bank, who've also had to respond and to try and streamline their processes around social and environmental safeguards, for example. On China's involvement in MDBs, I don't know what Patrick is referring to with regard to these green projects. But more broadly, China's involvement in MDBs is a very, it's a mediated one. So unlike the BRI or financing from Exim Bank, the capital that China pours into multilateral development banks is not necessarily controlled by China. So in the case of, as Chris Humphrey and I discussed in our paper, in these large co-financing funds that China has established, they put in capital, but what happens with that capital and the projects that come out of it is very much in the remit of the bank itself. And so for better or worse, the management of the funds and the staffing of these funds and the management of the bank plays, I think, a bigger role in the kind of outcomes that we see. I think this is an area where, China is very keen, as I said before, to be seen to play a collaborative and constructive role within the MDBs. And largely from what our research has indicated, China's contributions, let's say, both financially and in terms of its representation and contributions to the management, to the financial soundness of large but also small MDBs, has been fairly positive and constructive. As to how these kind of projects can be addressed, I think this is probably a wider question than just how China needs to improve. I think there's probably endemic issues with how infrastructure projects are implemented and planned in the first place. How much do they address local needs? and how much local capacity or absorption is there to manage these projects after contractors leave. But I'm happy to follow up on these discussions later offline.
And very briefly, I mean, how does that differ from the type of investment that comes through Chinese policy banks, say, and other sorts of, you know, these newer regional architectures that China is supporting that, you know, challenge the traditional multilateral institutions?
I think in sectoral focus, you know, China's or Chinese-led MDBs still have a strong sort of shared focus on economic infrastructure. There's a prioritization on economic growth, on creating infrastructure for connectivity, rather than this kind of prioritization of the sort of soft infrastructure like health or education sectors that we see more closely associated with the traditional donors or the traditional MDBs. I think where they differ is perhaps, you know, that governance does matter more. So for the MDBs, for the AIIB, as well as for the World Bank, you know, you will see a much more rigorous procurement process that may be more competitive, and that projects would have to follow a much more rigorous sort of approval process to gain finance. One of the major problems with the BRI and other Chinese kind of China's bilateral finance and policy banks is that, you know, in many cases there's a slightly problematic political economy around how projects are incepted. Chinese contractors have a huge economic interest in generating infrastructure projects, and there hasn't been enough of perhaps oversight and not enough rigor in how these projects are approved, which has led or at least contributed to some of the debt issues that we're seeing today. But I think this is also an area in flux, and we are seeing more kind of recognition of these problems within China's bilateral finance architecture.
Thank you very much, Yunnan. We're just coming up to the top of the hour, so I think I'd encourage people to have a look at the program. There's another panel coming up in the next hour about the Global Biodiversity Summit and China's contribution to that. Another crucial part of this critical year for the future of the UN Climate Convention and the Rio Conventions and the multilateral system, coming out of, as Malin said, a real low point in recent years. I think we've heard that, you know, leading that just transition to a carbon constrained world is an opportunity for China to show a certain type of leadership, but it's going to be very complicated, and these sorts of conversations are going to need to take place, even if we're not moving to a world, you know, without contention and only with dialogue. I think actually, you know, there will need to be competition and contention at lots of points along the way. Then at least, you know, keeping these kinds of open conversations, I think is going to be very important for maintaining peace and moving us to a just transition. So thank you very much to the panelists, Malin, Yunnan and Byford, and thank you also to the organizers, Chatham House and China Dialogue. And thank you very much to all our attendees. I hope you enjoyed the event. Thank you.